It is my honor and privilege to open this wonderful evening with such an honored guest and dear friend as Danny Matt. We're celebrating tonight the end of Danny's great translation project of the Zohar into English. I brought with me 3 volumes, but you need to imagine 12 volumes on this table. This is not a private celebration, and I can say not even a celebration to those like me who dedicate their life to study this phenomenal book. This is a historic celebration, a celebration for all generations to come. For Danny Matt's great project will persist long after we will be gone. 18 years ago, a group of scholars was invited to the US to discuss together the possibility of translating the thousands of passages of the Zohar into English. Some said, this is an impossible project. No one, they said, will be able to translate the obscure Aramaic language of the Zohar and turn it into a readable English. And now, 18 years after, we are here in Jerusalem celebrating the completion of this grand endeavor. The Pritzker edition of Danny Matt, with contribution by Joel Hecker and Nathan Wolski, will make the Zohar the most accessible it has ever been. This event calls for a Siyyum, a ritual traditionally said when one completed the study of Masechet, a tractate in the Talmud. This custom, first known by Abaye, the head of Pompedita Yeshiva in Babylon, who would make a big feast like the one you just had, for anyone in his yeshiva who completed a chapter of study. People perform Siyyum on many occasions. I feel that 18 years of poring over old manuscripts, finding a fitting translation for incredibly coded and dense passages and words of the Zohar, sitting in his home overlooking the Berkeley Hills, day after day, year in, year out, deserve this kind of festive acknowledgement. Please join me in this ritual, reciting the Hadran Alach, meaning we shall return to you, or as our dear colleague Shlomo Naeh taught me, really means your splendor, Hadar, will be on us. This is a traditional text with small changes we made for this occasion, some translation in light of Danny's himself. I want to call Danny to come to the stage. I would like you to rise, if it's possible, for the Hadran Alach. Hadran Alach ספר הזוהר והדרן עלן. דעתן הלך ספר הזוהר ודעתן עלן. לא נתנשי מנך ספר הזוהר ולא תתנשי מנן, לא בעלמא הדין ולא בעלמא דעתי. We will return to you, O Zohar, and you will return to us. Our splendor upon you, O Zohar, and your splendor upon us. Our mind is on you, O Zohar, and your mind is on us. We will not forget you, O Zohar, and you will not forget us, neither in this world nor in the world that is coming. You say Ha'arevna.
והערבנה אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפיפיות עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו כולנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. יהי רצון לפניך, אדוני אלוהי, כשם שעזרתנו לסיים ספר הזוהר, כך תעזרני להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם. ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים ורבי משה דליון, תעמוד לי ולזרעי, שלא תמוש התורה מפי ומפי זרעי עד עולם. ויתקיים בי בהתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, והקיצותה היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים במינה, בשמאלה עושר וכבוד. אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום.
Please be seated. So, Danny, you gave up an honored position of 20 years being a professor in the divinity school for University of California. What is the story of this magnificent project?
It's really a beautiful story how the Pritzker Zohar emerged. I was happy, more or less, teaching at an academic position in Berkeley, California. And in September 1995, I got a phone call from Art Green, who many of you know, who many of you have studied with. And Art and I have known each other for many, many years. And Art said to me, there's a wealthy family in Chicago named the Pritzkers who want to commission you to translate the Zohar. And I didn't know. I was shocked. I was overwhelmed. I'd never heard of the Pritzkers, but I think I told Art I have to think about this. And he said, of course. So I thought about it for a day, for a week, for several weeks, for several months. Finally, about 3 months later, I said, I hadn't yet talked with the Pritzkers or heard really much more about the project. I just said, let me try this for a month. So I sat down for 1 month during my winter break from teaching, and every day I would translate Zohar. Started from the beginning, and I did 4 or 5 hours a day, as much as I could handle. And after that month, I decided I'm definitely not doing this. It was just too draining. I just felt so exhausted. I said, how can I keep this up for years? So I called Art Green. I said, this is an amazing opportunity, but I just have to say no. And he said, I understand, but why don't you at least meet with the Pritzkers and tell them no? So that was my mistake. I agreed to meet, and Margot Pritzker, whose husband is the CEO of the Hyatt Corporation, Margot Pritzker had fallen in love with the Zohar and had studied with an Orthodox rabbi in Chicago. Some of you, I'm sure, know, Yechiel Pupko, from the esteemed Rabbinic family, the Pupko family. And Yechiel was working for the Chicago Federation, and as part of his work, he took groups to Poland. I believe he took the Pritzkers to Poland as part of the preparation for their son's bar mitzvah. And then he started tutoring their son, teaching him for bar mitzvah, but he had a condition. He said, I'll only tutor your son, Margot, if you'll also study with me. So Margot Pritzker and Rabbi Yechiel Pupko began studying, and because of her interest in Ruchaniyut, she wanted to do not just Parshat HaShavua, but to start studying the Zohar. So they used the existing English translation, the Sonsino Zohar. I'm sure many of you have it. And after a few weeks or a few months, one of them said to the other, Rabbi Pupko to Mrs. Pritzker, or vice versa, let's do a new translation. And she had read my book, The Essential Kabbalah, and that was how they approached me. So all this is going back a little bit further. So I finally met with Margot Pritzker and Rabbi Pupko, and I basically tried to talk her out of it, saying, there are already anthologies, and I've done an anthology, and I just feel it's too exhausting to take on. She said, I understand, but if you did do it, how long would it take? And I said, 12 to 15 years. She said, you're not scaring me. And somehow when I heard that, something flipped inside of me. And I think later I understood it was almost like a dare. She was saying, I'm not scared. How come you're scared? So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I walked out of the meeting having agreed to do it, and then for the next 18 years, worked on it. The first year in Berkeley, and then 4 years here. I thought it was a year. It turned into 2 and 3 and 4. 2 years on Givat Ram at the Institute for Advanced Study. And then I asked David Hartman if I could have a room here to continue working on it, and very graciously he gave me an office. So for 2 years, 2000 to 2002, I sat here and completed the first volume and wrote most of the second volume here at the Hartman Institute. So I feel a real connection here, and it's kind of completing a cycle having the Siyyum here tonight. So that's how it emerged.
Danny, when you were inside translating, sitting day after day, could you imagine what it's going to be like? And did you think about what's the future contribution of this translation to the generation to come?
I mean, I felt overwhelmed by the project at first. I think it took me about 5 years to really believe that I could finish it. Or what I completed was Zohar ala Torah. The 9 volumes completes the Zohar on the Torah. There are 3 other volumes being prepared by Joel Hecker and Nathan Wolski that cover other sections of the Zohar. Zohar on Ruth, Shir Shirim. I had a sense of the enormity of it. I think as volumes started coming out and people wrote to me about how they were able to understand Zohar, able to use it, able to teach from it, that kind of kept me going. That I needed that connection and that inspiration. But I just tried to, do a page at a time, a line at a time. The enormity of it was a little too much to always have present.
So now you completed, and I want you to think and to share with us, what's the contribution of this translation for the generation to come? Can it form a new Jewish life? Can it impact Jewish education? Does it impact your life? Do you celebrate Shabbat differently? What's the meaning of that?
Next question.
Just the beginning, Danny, I have more.
I would say, to me, the greatness of the Zohar is that it reimagines God. It reimagines God in several ways. One is, of course, Ein Sof, that God is ultimately boundless, that God is ultimately nameless. So it's really a critique of all our current theologies. It's really a critique of any box into which we've placed God. It's challenging you constantly to expand the boundaries. But in addition to Ein Sof, I think the next great contribution is Shekhinah. If we're going to talk about God, we need to balance the patriarchal with the feminine. And that's certainly one of the great contributions of the Zohar. So Ein Sof, God being beyond all names. But if we're going to talk about God, to balance the thousands of years of patriarchy with the feminine. And the next of the 3 chidushim, I think, the 3 main chidushim of the Kabbalah or the Zohar, is what's called in Hebrew tzorech gavoah, the need on high, right? The need that God has for us. So according to Kabbalah, God is incomplete without our active participation. And that radical idea, which has roots in Chazal, right? Almost everything in the Zohar is based in some way on rabbinic teaching. But the Zohar takes that and insists that God needs us. So that boldness I find, very exciting and inspiring. And I try to live according to that. My original interest in spirituality was something much simpler. It was really Hasidic spirituality. Somehow I took a little detour into Zohar, and that's taken me some decades. But my own personal Jewish practice, I have a preference for the simpler forms. Simply meditating on the name Yud He Vav He, or meditating on the Neshama, rather than some complex kabbalistic formula. What I really say is that I don't encourage people to become Kabbalists. You know, I don't think that really works today for most contemporary Jews. But I do feel that it's a great resource for Jewish spirituality, that we need to approach the Zohar with some critical apparatus, you know, with a critical approach, but open to its insights, and really inspired by how bold and creative the Zohar is. I'll read a couple passages in a few minutes, and it's almost not so much what the Zohar says, but how it says it, and that it's willing to be so radical in reimagining God. You know, it's kind of what the Midrash does to the Torah, and what the Zohar does to the Midrash, we need to do to the Zohar, to update it, to criticize it, to learn from it, but not to follow it slavishly.
I want to speak about this book that was translated now into Hebrew, Lev HaKabbalah. It's in about 7 languages, translated. What's the Lev HaKabbalah?
I'll say a word about this. I think many of you have the English edition, the Essential Kabbalah. I know some of you have it or have used it for teaching. About 3 or 4 years ago, my friend Yakub and I put out the Hebrew version of that. In other words, this is all the text that I translated from Hebrew to create the Essential Kabbalah. The original Hebrew or Aramaic is here in this book, Lev HaKabbalah. What I would suggest is that if you are willing or interested in teaching Kabbalah in your congregation or in your rabbinic work, I would love for you to teach the Zohar. And the classes that I'm teaching this week and next week, I'm trying to convince American rabbis that the Zohar is not that difficult. Not that difficult to read, even not that difficult to teach. But I realize that's asking for a lot. I hope really that rabbis will begin to teach Zohar to their congregation. But to start off with something simpler, to have an adult education course with the Essential Kabbalah and Lev HaKabbalah, where you, the teacher, have them both. And the students may have just the English, or those of them that can handle the Hebrew, that also. I think that would be a great intro to Kabbalah. There's some Zohar passages in this, but basically teachings organized according to topic. In Sof, Sefirot, living in the material world, prayer and meditation. So take a look at it later and see if that will work for you.
I want to go back to the term that you're using a lot, Danny, spirituality, and ask you, do you see spirituality overlapping Kabbalah? Is this the same? Are we putting, Buddhist ideas or ideas coming from the East in a very Jewish traditional book? Do you think that Kabbalah is spirituality? Is this the same, just in Hebrew? How do you see that?
Yeah. Kabbalah is many things, and one of the beautiful things about Kabbalah is that I think there is no one authentic Kabbalah. It's almost every teacher, every Kabbalist really formulated the teachings in his own way, and had a certain tradition and a certain audience, and Kabbalah gradually grows and evolves and eventually turns into Hasidism, right? Hasidut is really the first popularization of Kabbalah. There certainly are, spiritual elements within Kabbalah, but Kabbalah is halacha and minhag and some superstition, and so many things. Let's come to the root itself, the kabel. So Kabbalah is receiving. That means receiving teaching, receiving ancient wisdom, but I think it also means making yourself receptive. So opening up to the divine, opening up to the power that is within you and beyond you simultaneously, or the beyond that is within. Opening up to that, I think, is the first step, and that's characteristic of Kabbalah, and I think central to Ruchaniyut.
Can you live Zohar?
Can I leave it?
Can you live it? Can you practice
it
in your life? What does it mean? Chas v'chalila.
Now that I'm finally finished, can I leave it?
לא יתנשי מיני. I mean, how do you live Zohar? Is this like a book, or can you live Zohar? Can you live Zoharically?
Yeah, if you just study Zohar from a distance, you can gain an intellectual appreciation of it. The Zohar's power is connected to its hiddenness. The fact that the Zohar is a hidden book, it demands of the reader to make sense of it. The Zohar doesn't hand you things on a platter. The Zohar compels the reader to make sense not only of the word on the page, but of what's going on inside. Right? As you study Zohar, you think you're trying to decipher the text, but you're really working on your own inner dynamics, your own confusion. Right? You're trying to figure out what the word means, but you can do it only through navigating your inner pathways. I've really found that to be the case. That's why it's a spiritual activity to study. Now, this is true of any Torah. Right? To study Torah is a spiritual activity. In the Zohar, one of the main mystical techniques is Talmud Torah. Torah becomes a mystical act. You could say every mitzvah becomes a mystical act because the goal is to unite the Shekhinah with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Right? The union of the male and female halves of God depends on us. So how do we bring that about? By performing mitzvot. It's not some new invented kabbalistic technique. It's performing the mitzvot. The mitzvot themselves become what I like to call aphrodisiacs. Every mitzvah is an aphrodisiac for the divine couple. So Zohar comes alive just by trying to understand it, because you're involved in it. You can't understand it unless you're involved in it. And then living it out is, trying out some of the ways it describes. Shabbat becomes a celebration of the divine wedding. Right? So Lecha Dodi is a perfect recapitulation of the Zohar, the union of the Shabbat queen, of Shekhinah, with the Kadosh Baruch Hu is the hidden message of Lecha Dodi. You're living it out by welcoming the Shabbat as queen. So I think it's hard for the Zohar not to be experiential. Some scholars may succeed in totally draining it of experience, but it's very hard to do. And I think it naturally draws you into spiritual awareness, despite whatever distance you start out with.
Maybe you want to show it. Maybe you want to teach something.
Good. Just going to pick something by random here. No. I want to read to you one passage, and then I want to explain it. But I'm first going to read it, and I want you not to even think about what it means. If you want, you can follow it in the packet here, or if you prefer, just close your eyes and listen to the language. This is the opening passage of the Zohar on Bereshit. Okay, in this packet, the first page is the diagram of the 10 Sfirot, which we'll come back to in a moment. But the next page is what I'm going to read. It starts with the word Bereshit. As I say, you can follow this or just close your eyes and listen. This is the Zohar's interpretation of not even the whole first verse, just the first three words. Bereshit bara Elohim. Bereshit, in the beginning. At the head of potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed. From the head of infinity, a cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring, not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a cord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, splaying colors below, concealed within the concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof. It split and did not split its aura, was not known at all, until under the impact of splitting, a single concealed supernal point shone. Beyond that point, nothing is known. So it is called Reshit, beginning. first command of all. The enlightened will shine like the Zohar of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Zohar, radiance, concealed of concealed, struck its aura, which touched and did not touch this point. Then this beginning expanded, building itself a palace worthy of glorious praise. There it sowed seed to give birth, availing worlds. The secret is, her stock is seed of holiness. Zohar, radiance, sowing seed for its glory like the seed of fine purple silk, wrapping itself within, weaving itself a palace, constituting its praise, availing all. With this beginning, the unknown concealed one created the palace. This palace is called Elohim, God. The secret is Bereshit, bara, Elohim. With beginning, created God. That's crystal clear. I wanted to start with the words itself without analyzing it, but let me just explain to you with the diagram of the Sfirot what the Zohar is up to here. You turn back to that first page. This, of course, is the picture of the 10 qualities of God, the 10 Sefirot. Beyond all of these and permeating all of them is Ein Sof. God is infinity. But our mind cannot grasp the infinite. So you could say the Sefirot are the ways that the infinite makes itself accessible to the limited human consciousness. So the Zohar is describing here how the process of emanation, how this process of flow begins. Keter, the highest Sfirah, is really indistinguishable from Ein Sof. Chokhmah is the first point or ray of light. It's described as a ray of light flashing forth from that ocean of infinity, and therefore it's called Reshit. For the Zohar, Chokhmah is Reshit. Of course, this takes us back to Mishlei. Reshit Chokhmah Yirat Adonai. So Reshit and Chokhmah are identified. Why is Chokhmah Reshit? It looks like it's Sfirah number 2. But because Keter is just almost indistinguishable from Ein Sof, Keter shares in that infinity. The first Sfirah that really we can point to in any way is this flash of light, Chokhmah. The point of Chokhmah expands into the circle or the palace of Bina. Okay, and we're not going to go any further in this chart of the Sfirot tonight. All that the passage I read is trying to describe is how does that process occur? How does the point of Chokhmah, known as Reshit, expand into the palace of Bina? Chokhmah is actually father, Bina is mother. So already here we have the union of a divine couple. Later that will be repeated with Tiferet and Shekhinah, or Malchut. But now we're at the top of the Sphiratic tree. The Zohar is reading the first book of the Torah to explain how Bina, known as Elohim, emerges. So what is the Zohar doing? It's not reading it Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. How is it reading it? Hyper-literally. This is a word that's come up in the class that I've been teaching yesterday and today. The Zohar likes to read the Torah hyper-literally, even more literally than it's intended. What does that mean here? Bereshit is not in the beginning, but with beginning, namely with Chokhmah. Now, what does bara Elohim mean? Elohim for the Zohar is not the subject, but the object. It's not in the beginning Elohim created. It's in the beginning it created Elohim. Elohim becomes the object of the verse. So who is the subject? The subject is unnamed. But that's perfect because the subject is Ein Sof, who is the unnameable. So Bereshit bara Elohim means with beginning, by means of beginning, the unnameable one, bara Elohim, created Bina. Okay, that sounds bizarre. That sounds heretical, that God is created. The Torah is obviously saying God created. I think, or you're asking, what does this personally mean for me? What this means for me is that our notions of God are puny. Our notions of God are totally inadequate compared to the boundlessness of God. What we call Elohim is somehow the second. You know, you could almost say this is putting God second. It's a very different approach, but the Zohar is saying the ultimate God is Ein Sof. What you think of God is secondary to Ein Sof. It's not separate from Ein Sof, it's really emanated or fashioned through the power of Ein Sof, but there's something beyond what we think of as God. The great Christian mystic, Meister Eckhart, has a beautiful phrase, the God beyond God. And that's very much what the Zohar has in mind with Ein Sof. So that's one passage of Zohar.
You're basically saying that all other, streams of thought in Jewish life is avodah zarah, if this is the emunah. Yes, everything that you say, this is
all
God.
All of theology.
Yeah, this is God. You're actually saying the Zohar is saying you're actually in avodah zarah because you have to open up your mind to all kinds of possibilities, even though to say there's no yesh me'ayin. God didn't create it from nothing. Yeah, so it's upside down from all theology we know.
Yeah, I don't know if it's calling it avodah zarah, but it's certainly a critique. It's a critique of theology. It's saying all theology is inadequate. The only description of God that works is the nameless. And you mentioned yesh me'ayin is very interesting, right? The traditional notion is that God created the world out of nothing. For the Zohar, the highest sphira, Keter, is given this beautiful paradoxical name, ayin. Now, this is not nothing with a small n. This is nothing with a capital N. Or I would say it's better pronounced no-thingness. Ayin is the no-thingness of God. You could say the pure, undifferentiated divine energy, which becomes everything. But in itself, it is no thing. It's not nothing in that as that, it doesn't exist. It's no-thingness. And what we know of the world emerges from ayin. So the teachings on ayin are really beautiful. Esa enai leharim me'ayin yavo ezri. Not as a question, as a declaration. My help comes from being able to touch that divine no-thingness. This is one of the hardest things to understand in Kabbalah, the paradoxical notion of nothing. It's a very positive term in Kabbalah. Moshe DeLeon, in one of his Hebrew writings, interprets the line in Kohelet, umotar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin. Okay, of course, in Kohelet, that's a negative statement. The advantage of a human over the beast is nothing. For the Zohar, it means the advantage we have over beasts is that we can touch ayin. We can attain that no-thingness. We can melt into the divine oneness. That's motar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin. The Zohar loves to take verses and turn them on their heads. And maybe I'll take that opportunity to look at the second passage with you. This is my favorite passage in the Zohar, although my children tell me that I say that about many passages. But we have this in a few versions here. I'm just going to look at the shorter, simplest version with you. This is on page 5. The top it says, he drove out et ha'adam, and the bottom has the Aramaic and the Hebrew. This, by the way, is a beautiful edition of the Zohar reproduced here. It's called Sefer HaZohar B'Lashon HaKodesh. It has the Aramaic text, Minukad, and the Hebrew text, Minukad. It's a beautiful edition. Okay, the pasuk is Vayigaresh et ha'adam. Okay, it's obvious what's happened. The scene, of course, is Gan Eden. God expels the human being. Let's work with the Aramaic below. Match it up with the Hebrew, match it up with the English. Vayigaresh et ha'adam. Amar Rabbi Elazar. La yadana man aved tiruchin laman. We don't know who caused tiruchin, Aramaic word for divorce. Okay, he's playing with legaresh and gerushin. We don't know who divorced whom. Now, why does he say that? Because the Midrash already says it's as if God and Adam were married. But because Adam failed to fulfill the first mitzvah, God divorced Adam. How do we know that God divorced Adam? Because it says, Vayigaresh et Adam. So the Midrash already plays on legaresh as gerushin, but the Zohar asks an astounding question here. We don't know who divorced whom. Okay, what are the alternatives? Ikud shabrichu aved tiruchin la'adam, Did the Kadosh Baruch Hu divorce Adam, or what's the alternative? Adam divorced God. The Zohar is not going to say something so shocking. What does the Zohar say? Or not? This is a perfect example how the Zohar makes the reader come up with the message. The Zohar doesn't give it to you. The Zohar stimulates your mind enough. The reader can't avoid but think, okay, what's the alternative? Did God throw Adam out of the garden or not? Aval mila itapich. The whole word is turned on its head. The verse is turned upside down. Don't read it vayigaresh et Adam, read it vayigaresh et. Now who is et? Those of you know, whenever I ask a question, the correct answer is Shekhinah. Why is Shekhinah et? Because she is Aleph to Taf. The first Sphira, Keter, is actually symbolized by Aleph. So you might think Shekhinah, the last Sphira, would be Taf. No, she's Aleph to Taf. She includes the whole stream of emanation, all the flow of Shefa. So she is the Alpha and the Omega. She is Aleph to Taf. You know, that word et is so beautiful, right? It's a word that encompasses everything, but means nothing. This is too good for a rabbi to pass up, right? And we know rabbis who built their career on interpreting et. For example, Rabbi Akiva loved to interpret et so much that his colleagues came to him and said, Dayecha, right? Instead of Dayenu, Dayecha, enough with your ets already. And by the way, I'm sure many of you know, Ben Gurion tried to eliminate et. He wrote letters to the editor, he wrote letters to the academia saying, why are we wasting valuable printer's ink on this word? It doesn't mean anything. Okay, he wasn't completely successful, but modern Hebrew does have fewer ets than classical Hebrew. But for the Zohar, et here is just too good to avoid. Vayigaresh et means he drove out Shekhinah. Who drove out Shekhinah? Then we read the next word, ha'adam. That's how the Zohar turns this verse on its head. Uman geresh et ha'adam. Ha'adam vadai geresh et. Uviginda kativ vayishalchehu Adonai Elohim migan Eden. The Zohar doesn't deny that God did expel Adam, but why did God expel him? Amai vayishalchehu begin de gerash Adam et kida ka'amaran, as we have said. I love that, as we have said. When did he say it? 2 lines earlier. But now all of a sudden it's a tradition. This is instant tradition. The Zohar likes to create instant tradition. So this sounds intriguing, this sounds radical, but what does that mean? Adam divorced Shekhinah. It may mean that he should have focused on the union of the divine couple. He should have contemplated the union of Shekhinah and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Instead, he split the two apart. Maybe he grabbed Shekhinah for himself. I like to think that this has a psychological meaning. After all, what happens to Adam and Eve in the garden, really? According to the Pshat, they become self-conscious. They become self-aware. So this is talking about the natural step in growth, in maturation of discovering the self, discovering the ego. Right? Every baby goes through that process. Each of us had a state in which we were mystics. Every baby is a mystic. Because the baby doesn't distinguish between self and the world, between self and mother. At some point during the 2nd or 3rd year, we discover that we have a self. If we don't discover that, we don't last very long. But there's a price we pay for that discovery of self. We split ourselves off from the oneness, from the divine. And I think that's part of what's implied here. Adam divorced himself from the one. You might say that what he's saying is we're still in the garden, but we don't realize it because we've lost touch with Shekhinah or with the oneness. So Kabbalah or religion or spirituality is trying to reacquaint ourselves with Shekhinah, with the divine presence, with the totality, Aleph to Taf.
Wow. This is so beautiful. I must say that we as scholars in Israel use this Danny Matt's translation. Even if we have a translation to Hebrew, we always look to see what Danny actually wrote in his translation. What about the Shekhinah, Danny? Tell me, what's the story about the Shekhinah?
You know, Shekhinah is the main character of the Zohar. Shekhinah is really, one of the great innovations. this is something, that's obviously not invented by the Kabbalah. In Sof, that name for God never appears before the Kabbalah. Shekhinah, of course, as you all know, appears so many times in Chazal, and she already has a certain feminine quality there, but the Talmud doesn't come out overtly and say Shekhinah is, the feminine. You would never find in a rabbinic source the Kadosh Baruch Hu and Shekhinah. Okay, they're really almost identical. The Kadosh Baruch Hu emphasizes more God's transcendence. Shekhinah emphasizes God's immanence. So you have that sense of Shekhinah in Talmud and Midrash already. What's new in Kabbalah, or you might say what's new and ancient, is that there actually is a divine romance. There's something like a goddess, or God is both God and goddess. Now I say new and ancient because it's radically new, but in some ways it's recovering what was part of the ancient Near East, right? We certainly know that there were feminine goddess figures who were attractive to the Israelites. Anat, Asherah, Ashtoret, right? We know that because of all the prophetic critiques of the people going after the false gods and goddesses. So you could say the feminine was there in ancient Israel, but it was rejected, it was expunged, it was read out of the tradition. The biblical authors were basically successful in eliminating the feminine from the divine. And now somehow, several thousand years later, 2,000 years later, the Shekhinah re-emerges right in the heart of Rabbinic Judaism. Shekhinah, of course, is already there in Chazal, but in Kabbalah, what do you have? Shalom calls it, an amazing phrase, Shalom calls this the revenge of myth. Okay, the feminine had been squashed, had been expunged, had been almost totally eliminated, but somehow there must have been a subterranean existence, and Shekhinah re-emerges now in all her glory. And I think it's that return of the repressed, or the return of what seemed to have been eliminated, that conveys some of the power of Shekhinah.
You're speaking about the genealogy of the Shekhinah, but I'm speaking, what does it contribute to your life that God described also in a feminine aspect? What does it
That
add?
God is feminine, that God is accessible. I mean, you could say much of Kabbalah is a reaction against the Rambam. Okay, the fact that Maimonides dies right before Kabbalah emerges, I think, is no accident. The Kabbalists learn from the Rambam. They're indebted to the Rambam because Ein Sof is basically the Maimonidean God. Right? The Rambam will be totally happy with Ein Sof. He's turning over in his grave when he hears us talking about Sfirot and male and female and all of the romance and sexual language, sexual union. So there's that conflict, Ein Sof, the God who's abstract, but so abstract, I think the Kabbalah is reacting against the abstractness of God and trying to find a way to relate to God intimately, personally. So that's what Shekhinah represents, and that's, finding God within, or feeling yourself directly in touch, and not just, no longer being content with pure transcendence.
I want to challenge you a little bit, Danny.
What was it up till now?
You were great.
Yeah.
Some people think that Kabbalah is a kind of a madness. That people live in an imaginary world, that they think that all kinds of entities are living next to them, if it's the Shekhinah, if it's the dark side, the Sitra Achra, and that it's a kind of, running away from rational thinking, from being attached to scientific evidence, living in non-realistic world. What do you think about that?
I think that it's good to be critical of Kabbalah. As I was saying, I don't accept everything in Kabbalah as true. I see certain vital insights.
Do you believe in the Shekhinah?
Shekhinah, I feel her presence.
I was asked this, so I'm asking you. You feel? Uh-huh.
Yeah, I feel that presence, but I think, as I said, we need to update the Kabbalah. Okay, what what Midrash does to Torah, what Zohar does to Midrash, we need to do to Zohar to, I think it can reanimate Jewish worship. I think it can make God real for a person. But the superstitious elements and some of the misogyny and some of the chauvinism, I think, have to be identified and criticized and rejected.
Yeah, what did you do with these passages, misogynies and describing women also as a divine, as you mentioned, but also as wicked and demonic, and many passages calling to take revenge of non-Jews? How did you dealt with this in your translation?
I'm not trying to be apologetic for the Zohar. I translate it and write the commentary. I don't try to excuse it. Sometimes I'll give some historical context. What's happening to Jews in Christian Spain, and they're wondering, has God abandoned us? How come the Christians are running the show? Sometimes the demonic is identified with Christianity because of the political situation. On the other hand, the Zohar is influenced by Christianity. So there's a dialectical relationship with the society, with the culture, and that's very instructive too. The Zohar is not created in a vacuum. The 13th century is really a renaissance, right? We think of 15th century Italy, but 13th century Spain was really a land of renaissance. The ruler at the time was named Alfonso the Wise, Alfonso el Sabio, and he's trying to collect all the wisdom of the world, all the learning of the world. He hires Jews and Muslims to translate works, scientific works, philosophical works, from Arabic into Castilian, into Spanish. He's creating a world culture, and the Zohar may be part of that. The author of the Zohar, Moses de Leon, probably had some connections with the royal court, and maybe he's offering to Alfonso another ancient book. Alfonso has all these ancient books of wisdom, and Moshe de Leon may be offering him another one. I don't know if it goes that far, but the historical reality is important to see. That's something you lose if you insist that the Zohar goes back to Rabbi Shimon. If you think the Zohar was composed in the 2nd century, I think you lose some of the understanding, as opposed to Moses de Leon living in Catholic Spain, wrestling with the notion of Jesus as the Son of God. Right? So the Zohar said, we have our own son. Or, we can contact God directly. That famous line, what's the most famous passage in the whole Zohar? Brich Shmei, right? Because that passage is in not only the Sephardic, but the Ashkenazic Nusach. And that passage has an amazing line, La al enash rachitzna, v'la al bar elahin samichna. We don't rely on a human being. We don't need an angel. But what's the angel? Bar Elahin, Ben Elohim. The Zohar is saying we don't need a son of God. He's writing in Christian Spain saying we don't need a son of God. We have direct access to God. So the Zohar is wrestling with its contemporary society, not, creating truth out of the blue. And that historical context it's something we can relate to.
I want to ask about the notion of you mentioned before, avodat tzorech gavoa, our deeds in this world, doing something for the divine world. Mm-hmm. Isn't that leads people to think they're omnipotent and that they can do everything, megalomaniac kind of? And I really wanted to ask, is it so different from Daniel's idea about putting God second? Where is it? You can do everything to God, you can manipulate God, you can... So are we putting God second?
I think we're putting the traditional notion of God second to something new, to Ein Sof or to the feminine. There certainly is a critique of standard Jewish theology. The empowerment of the individual, the empowerment of the individual Jew, this is probably in part also a response to the powerlessness of the Jews in Europe, in Spain at the time. So somehow it's saying, don't think that we're unimportant. We are vital to the whole cosmic machinery. But I think, ultimately what the Zohar is saying is that there's not a sharp division between the human and the divine. It's using these mythical descriptions, it's using this poetic language to insist, this is the basic claim of all mysticism. East and West, that we are part of that oneness. You know, and in a sense, that's a wild, poetic, religious idea. In a sense, it's scientific fact. Right? A scientist would say that ultimately we all go back to a cosmic seed. Everything emerged out of that initial oneness. What is the Big Bang but insisting that originally everything was one?
So what's this idea about the oneness is so crucial to your life, Danny?
You know, there must be I think there's in each of us a memory, there's some psychic memory or biological memory of being, you could say, of being an infant or being in the womb, before we took on this persona of being who I am as an individual, maybe something in us remembers being part of that oneness. Let me pivot for a minute to contemporary science. You know, I've written a book called God and the Big Bang and recently revised that. I recently put out a second edition. But I want to tell you one insight I came to, which is about, I think what many people would say is the most mundane thing in the world, which is gravity. Gravity does not sound very spiritual. Gravity is kind of what brings you down. Okay, spirituality is how you ascend. Gravity is what brings you down. But think for a moment, okay, if I drop this, where is it going to? You could say it's going to the table, but really it's going to the stage. Really it's going to the floor. Where is it ultimately heading? It can't stop. It wants to keep falling to where? To the center of the earth. Okay, but the whole earth is falling. The whole earth is falling toward the sun. The only reason we don't fall in is because we're going fast enough not to fall in. But we're all being drawn not to the center of the earth. We're really all being drawn to the center of the sun. But of course, that's being drawn to the center of the galaxy, to the black hole in the middle of the Milky Way galaxy. And the Milky Way galaxy is being drawn back to its local neighborhood of galaxies. And of course, all that's being drawn back. So ultimately, where is everything being drawn back by the power of gravity? To the initial moment of the Big Bang. Everything is being drawn back toward oneness. That's not some fanciful, mystical idea. I mean, it is, but it's also plain science. Gravity is really the yearning of everything for the initial oneness. We don't get there because the universe is also expanding. And in fact, now it's realized not only is it expanding, it's accelerating. But the expansion is competing with the gravity. The gravity is trying to draw us all back to oneness. The expansion is, you could say, individuality or separate existence. And there's a tug between the two. But the reason I said that is because I'd like to bring oneness out of the realm of cloudy, ethereal, poetic thinking to scientific fact. That's more exciting to me than even a poetic description.
Yeah, we discussed it the other day because I don't see the Zohar as a science book. I see it as, as one of the deepest religion book that deals with the crucial component of life, of love and relationship and fears, lots of fears, and sexuality and death. And is this a science book? Do you see it as a science book, or you're trying to prove the cosmological theories by the Zohar, or the other way around? Is this a science book?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's a science book. I'm intrigued when you find a resonance between scientific descriptions and mystical descriptions. I'm not saying that Moses de Leon knew what Stephen Hawking would discover, but somehow that the mystic and the physicist they discover similar formulations, not identical. I want to respect each in its own right, but when they harmonize, that's something to celebrate. This brings me to how do we know that Einstein was a Jewish mystic? If you open up the Encyclopedia Judaica for Einstein, there's a nice picture of Albert Right above his head it says, Ein Sof. Just happens to be the preceding entry. I don't offer that as ironclad proof, but just as asmachta.
Sense of humor. There's a lot of sense of humor in the Zohar. Danny, I think you're in the right place.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you last question before opening. It's Pinchas of Koritz, one of the great masters of Hasidism, actually Gershon Sholem quotes it, said that the Zohar kept him in Jewish life.
Right.
Are you identify with this statement? Did you find minutes in your life yet you said, oh, good, I was born after the Zohar was existing life. Otherwise, I was out.
Yeah, I don't know if otherwise I would have been entirely out, but certainly without the Zohar, I would feel Yiddishkeit was much drier than it could be. So the Zohar has reanimated Jewish practice for me, even though I think I want something simpler than exactly what the Zohar describes, but that love of creativity, that passion for Chidushei Torah, for not being satisfied with the Pshat, that is one of the great messages of the Zohar.
Thank you, Danny. And now...
Thank you.
Hadran alach. Your splendor, your hadar is upon us. I want now to open for questions. Yes, please.
We're celebrating you as well as your accomplishment. I'm just thinking about your dad, and I want to know, as you were doing this project, where was he in the project? And what might he be saying at the completion of the project?
Yeah. Thank you. My father, Herschel Matt, was a conservative rabbi. In fact, my brother, my father, my grandfather all graduated from JTS. I think my grandfather in 1912 made one of the first classes. But my dad, it's funny, my dad never promoted Kabbalah or Hasidism. He had a little bit more of a rationalistic approach, and he wanted to preserve the gap between the human and the divine. So he was a little bit suspicious of Jewish mysticism, but I felt a very genuine ruchniyut from him and with him. I just remember, sitting close to him Shabbat morning, and Hashamayim misaprim kavod el, u'ma'aseh yadav magid harakia. Just the kavanah that I felt from him, I'm sure is what drew me to looking for that element within Judaism through Martin Buber, Hasidic texts. And these Hasidic texts would always quote this strange book, the Zohar, and it was these fragments quoted in Hasidic texts that excited me. And I'm sure that was stimulated by my dad's devotion and devekut, even though he was uncomfortable with certain aspects of Kabbalah, which is I am also. But I assume he's happy. Thank you.
I have a question about the authorship of Zohar, because I had heard that Moses de Leon was, considered to be the writer, but that there was other scholarship saying that it was actually a compilation of a lot of different things. So I wonder what you have to say about that.
Yeah, the Zohar presents itself as being the work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, of course, and Sholem wrote in the early part of the 20th century that he was convinced that Moses de Leon wrote the entire Zohar. That's the picture presented in Major Trends in Judaism. So through the work especially of Yehuda Liebes and Ronit Meroz and others, it's now pretty clear that Moses de Leon did not write the entire Zohar. My guess is that he wrote something like 75% of Guf HaZohar, of the Zohar on the Torah. Okay, there certainly were other people involved, but there's no one who matches Moses de Leon's intimate connection with the Zohar. I mean by that, Moshe de Leon never admitted that he wrote the Zohar, but he does admit that he wrote other books. He says, I, Moshe de Leon, am writing this book, Shekel HaKodesh, Mishkan HaEdut. Sefer HaMishkal. Is it 5 or 10 books of Kabbalah? He says, I'm writing this book in Guadalajara, Spain that is, in the year 1293. In the year 1286. He dates it, he says where he wrote it, and then what does he do? He quotes the Zohar. You know, I felt a little bit guilty tonight promoting my book, but Moshe DeLeon promotes the Zohar. What does he do? He says in his Hebrew books, Ra'iti bamidrash. And then he'll bring a little Zohar translated into Hebrew. Or Amru HaKadmonim. Right? Who are the Kadmonim? The circle of Rashbi, but maybe it's really his own circle. Or my favorite one is Matzati b'Yerushalmi. Now, how many people know the Yerushalmi that thoroughly that they could identify, does this come from the Yerushalmi or doesn't it? So under the guise of those openings, he brings Zohar and spreads Zohar. He's trying to spread the Zohar. So he himself is involved, and I'm sure there are other people, and we may never know exactly. Maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll, please.
Danny, Yasher Koach on your wonderful contribution.
Thank you.
I'm sure you get asked this question a lot. What is your opinion and your take on the popularization of Kabbalah and mysticism, in particular through the Kabbalah Center and various celebrities who are dabbling in this?
Yeah. You know, I don't see it as black and white. There certainly are negative aspects for the Kabbalah Center. In my mind, the two main ones are, you know, bilking people and, you know, telling people, buy this set of Zohar and your operation will go well, or, you know, preying on people's fears, preying on people's weakness. That certainly is, you know, a big negative. The other is related to this historical question: when was the Zohar written? The people in the Kabbalah Center, they're aware of Shalom, they're aware of modern scholarship. They know there's a high likelihood the Zohar is really medieval, but it sells better if it's ancient. So they say that it is ancient. So those are among the negatives. The positive thing is that people know now that there is such a thing as Kabbalah. Okay, and 20, 30 years ago, it was relatively unknown. I think it's somewhat embarrassing to rabbis, too, that people, you know, are going to the Kabbalah Center and not coming to Shul. There's something that's, you know, there has to be an awareness that something is attracting people to that spirituality, and how to bring that back to the synagogue. One more question. Yeah. This is coming.
Yeah, so this book obviously must have taken you much time to write. I was just wondering kind of what is your next project?
Yeah, you know, it was hard going at first, but then I discovered Google Translate, and then it just went. Yeah, I'm not sure what I'll work on. I want to write something without any footnotes. Maybe a mystery novel about Zohar, maybe a simple book of spirituality. But I feel somewhat drained and exhausted from the 18 years. And I want to travel and teach. I really didn't do a lot of teaching during that whole time, and it's wonderful to do that again, especially teaching rabbis, but to spread some of these teachings. Biti reminds me that we still actually have a little bit of time. I'd like to read one last parable, and then take another question or two, and then we'll close. If you look at the last page here, this is another of those, my favorite passage in the Zohar. But this really is, I think, the whole Zohar al regel achat. I think this one parable, and I'm sure many of you have read this before. Some of you, I'm sure, have studied it with me, but take a look at it. This one we'll just look at in the English. Below you have the Aramaic in the larger font and the Hebrew in the smaller font. We'll treat ourselves here just to the English. There was a man who lived in the mountains. He knew nothing about those living in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city. They offered him good bread. The man asked, "What's this for?" They replied, "It's bread to eat." He ate and it tasted very good. He asked, "What's it made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later, they offered him thick loaves kneaded with oil. Okay, challah. He tasted them and asked, "What are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later, they offered him royal pastry kneaded with honey and oil. Okay, baklava. He asked, "What are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." He said, "Surely I am the master of all of these, since I eat the essence of all of these, wheat." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost to him. So it is with one who grasps the principle, but is unaware of all those delectable delights, diverging from that principle. Okay, this is a critique of fundamentalism. Okay, not Christian fundamentalism, but 13th century Jewish fundamentalists. The author of the Zohar must have known Jews who were committed to Torah but couldn't get beyond the literal meaning. Okay, that's probably the wheat kernels, the essence of Torah. Now it's interesting, he comes to town and they give him bread and he likes the bread. So bread is probably the transition from pshat to drash. Okay, from the Torah to the oral Torah. That he likes, he appreciates, and they give him the next level. Probably stands here for philosophical allegory, a philosophical reading of Torah. That's the thick loaves kneaded in oil. Notice he's more hesitant. Doesn't say he ate, he tasted. Then they give him the ultimate delight, the baklava. Now baklava sounds like what? Kabbalah. See, some things you lose in translation, but then there are new opportunities that arise in translation. So the ultimate delight, the baklava, what happens? Doesn't even taste it. He just asks his analytical question, what's it made of? They say wheat. He says, I know from wheat. Okay, so this is someone who's so dominated by the literal meaning of Torah, he can't see how it could expand in meaning. What I love here is that the essence of Torah, you can't deny that he has the essence. Right? And usually in a mystical text, the goal is to get to the essence. What's the essence of life? What's the meaning of life? This guy has the essence. But you could say he's wallowing in essence. He's drowning in essence. He can't appreciate the beautiful variety of life, of Torah. So the Zohar is saying, don't commit that kind of idolatry. Don't become fixated on one notion of God or on one reading of the text. Be open to the new possibilities of meaning. Any thoughts or questions about this or in general? Please.
I just wanted to know if Mrs. Pritzker got to read the last volume.
1 second. Start again.
I just wanted to know if Mrs. Pritzker lived to see you finish this project.
Yeah. She is alive and well and studies Zohar regularly with Rabbi Yechiel Pupko and using our translation. Yeah. I'm sorry? How far has she gotten? I don't know. In Zohar, a little is a lot. I'm not saying it's about her. I'm saying in general. A little is a lot. It doesn't matter so much where you start, either. The Zohar repeats itself a lot and always is coming up with new tricks, so you can pretty much dive in anywhere. Maybe these two folks, then please. Baklava, fairly close. Yeah. You can take the mic so people can hear. Please.
You could technically write baklava as the letters of Kabbalah if you turn them around in Hebrew.
Yeah.
But in a way, if the essence is the raw food, then everything else that the world creates and provides, in a way, is like to throw out everything and just stick to the essence and be extreme and a fundamentalist in raw food. In a way, it's like the same thing in terms of the parallelism, because Kabbalah is also parallelism. Kabbalah, makbil, makbil.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, if you leave off the end of this parable, you don't really know if this guy is the hero or the villain, right? Because usually it's good to have essence. As I was saying, in a mystical text, the greatest thing is to have the essence. But the Zohar is Jewish mysticism. It's not just mysticism, it's Jewish mysticism. So it's saying, appreciate the variety. Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od. There's something beautiful about the bread emerging from the wheat. There's something beautiful about the cake. There's something beautiful about the baklava. Don't insist on limiting yourself, even if you think you have the essence. So in a way, it's a critique, not of tradition, it's a critique of mysticism. Don't think that the ultimate is the essence. See all the things that that essence could become. Be open to the variety. You know, what the Kabbalah calls Sod HaEfshar. That's one of the Kabbalah's names for Shekhinah. Sod HaEfshar. And that relates to Torah as well. Last question.
Do you have any anticipation? Do you anticipate any future relationship with the Pritzkers for your work?
I mean, I have a bond with them, and I don't know what will grow from it, but for Margot Pritzker, it's been a major event in her life, and I'm thrilled that she dared me to do it. So, thank you. Thank you, Biti.
I just want to thank one word to Danny. I think there's a contrast between the amazing project that you did to the Jewish people and to the world and your humble personality. And I want to thank you in a personal for this evening, but I really want to thank you for doing this for forever, for the generation to come. Thank you so much, Danny. Toda rabba.
Bye-bye.